Belatedly welcome to Morgan Windsor's PhD confirmation seminar. Morgan is part of the QT Centre for Robotics and the ITTC Training Centre for Joint Biomechanics. The confirmation seminar is a formal one-year milestone in the PhD, whereby the candidate will do a 45-minute presentation. They also submit a long report. It's to check how they're going, to provide constructive input from a panel of experts on what they can do for the rest of their PhD and so on. So we'll run it as per the normal timeline, so we won't put pressure Morgan to do it in 35 minutes because that would be very uncool. And Toby will run the question and answer time, and then separately the panel will confer as to the feedback. All right, take it away.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for being at my confirmation seminar today. Today I'll be presenting my research, which is titled Localization Quality Prediction in Visual Guidance for Robot-Assisted Shoulder Arthroplasty. This might be in focus. During this seminar, I'll be presenting an introduction and motivation to my research. I'll then present a literature review on some key prior work that's relevant to the research. I'll then present my research plan, the progress that I've made on my research plan, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. Before I get into the main part of the seminar though, please be aware that there are a few surgical images which will be shown during this. So to our introduction and motivation. The backdrop of this research is the ARC Industrial Transformation and Training Centre for Joint Biomechanics. This is a collaborative research and training centre that focuses on addressing problems associated with biomechanics and orthopedics that have an industry and clinical focus. This ITTC provides us with access to a range of industry and clinical partners who are focused primarily in the space of shoulder surgery, and that motivates our initial interest in shoulder arthroplasty, which is shoulder joint replacement surgery. Additionally, as this PhD is part of an ITTC, there is an officially required industry engagement component, despite research being our primary objective. So, what is a total shoulder arthroplasty? This is an orthopedic surgical procedure that replaces the glenohumeral joint in the shoulder. This is the joint where the head of the humerus, so your upper arm bone, articulates on a socket on your scapula or shoulder blade called the glenoid. This arrangement is sometimes described as a golf ball on a golf tee, as you can see here, due to the large size of the humeral head and comparatively small and shallow glenoid cavity. This gives the joint an enormous range of motion, but it comes at the expense of stability, where a lot of the stability in this joint is provided by what's called the rotator cuff, which is a series of 4 muscles that pull the head of the humerus into the glenoid cavity. There's 2 major variations of a total shoulder arthroplasty. First is the anatomic total shoulder arthroplasty, where after the surgery, the original ball and socket arrangement of the anatomy is maintained, and that's what's shown here. The other variation is the reverse total shoulder arthroplasty, which swaps the ball and socket arrangement, installing what's called a glenosphere in place of the socket, and putting a socket on the head of the humerus, and that's what's shown here. An anatomic total shoulder arthroplasty is used to treat the pain associated with arthritis, which is where you lose the cartilage in the joint and you have a lot of pain from bone rubbing on bone, but that relies on an intact rotator cuff in order to stabilize the joint. A reverse total shoulder arthroplasty is used in cases of rotator cuff damage. So why do we care about this? Currently, total shoulder arthroplasty is the fastest growing joint replacement procedure in the world. In Australia, there were almost 8,000 of these surgeries performed in 2019, and that represents nearly double the number since 2008. This growing demand means we need to improve surgeon throughput without compromising patient outcomes. So far in Australia, nearly 10% of all total shoulder arthroplasties that have been performed have been revision procedures. This is a second or subsequent surgery performed when a previous surgery fails or when an implant wears out. Literature has identified that glenoid component positioning is key to surgical outcomes. It impacts joint stability after the surgery and implant longevity. Unfortunately, surgeons often have difficulty reproducing the planned position of a glenoid component. One meta-analysis found that nearly 70% of glenoid components that were positioned using manual tools were malpositioned, which is defined as more than 4 millimeters or more than 10 degrees deviated from their planned final position. So why is it so challenging? The final position of the glenoid component during surgery is defined by the surgeon when they place a guide wire or pilot hole into the glenoid cavity. The tools that are then used to prepare the bone for the implant are guided by the positioning of this guide wire or pilot hole. So it's critical to get this right, but that's difficult. Largely due to the very limited bone exposure that's provided to the surgeon during the procedure, but also because of a large patient-to-patient variation in anatomy. This image here shows the typical exposure of the scapula that you see during surgery. So this is the only part of the bone that the surgeon can use to position their wire correctly. And this is a glenoid here. And this is the same piece of bone with a guide wire placed. This brings us to our key research motivation. Given these challenges, there is significant potential for computer-based technology, including computer vision, to provide new tools to assist surgeons in performing their surgery more accurately and repeatedly. And that brings us to the literature review and what work has already been done in this area. Computer-assisted orthopedic surgery is the use of computer-based tools to assist surgeons in planning and executing orthopedic surgical procedures. And these tools are either used for the planning stage before surgery or execution during surgery. Planning software at the moment allows surgeons to take preoperative scans like CTs and MRIs, produce 3D models of patient anatomy, and then plan positioning of implants to maximize their joint range of motion and minimize the amount of bone that needs to be removed. Then, the tools they have available to help them execute these plans are patient-specific instruments, surgical navigation systems, and surgical robotics. Patient-specific instruments are custom manufactured tool guides that clip onto a patient's bones in one very particular way and are then used to guide the guide wire positioning. And that's what this is here. This white device is a patient-specific instrument. Surgical navigation systems provide surgeons with real-time feedback of the positions of their tools relative to the patient anatomy and their surgical plan. At the moment, this is usually done by displaying information on a 2D computer screen, so the surgeon has a view similar to this, but there's a lot of work happening in trying to transition this into the use of mixed reality. Finally, we have orthopedic surgical robots. In orthopedics, robots are almost exclusively semi-active. That means that these robots guide motions that are controlled and initiated by a surgeon rather than performing them autonomously. One example is the Stryker Mako robot, where bone preparation for implant positioning is performed using a burr tool the surgeon manually controls. That tool is connected to a robot arm, and when the tool gets to the edge of a pre-planned cutting area, the robot arm stiffens and stops the surgeon being able to remove any bone. These robots have been shown to improve implant positioning and patient outcomes for knee and hip arthroplasty, which is knee and hip joint replacement, but there are none currently available for shoulder arthroplasty. So what are the limitations to these? The key steps in intraoperative navigation and intraoperative robots are the registration and tracking stages of the workflow. In registration, a transform is determined between the preoperative plan and the patient in the operating room, essentially allowing the system to align the plan with the patient. And then during tracking, the patient and any tools are continually localized as they move during the surgery. These current systems rely on optical tracking. This is highly accurate, but it does have a number of drawbacks. This includes the registration process, which is currently manually performed. The surgical team uses a specially calibrated probe to trace over the anatomy of the bone. This adds workload to the surgical team, but it also has the potential to introduce human error. Then, tracking relies on markers. That includes markers for patient tracking. These markers can become obscured, they can move after they are placed and registered, and for patient markers, they require larger or additional incisions in order to be mounted on the bones. Where they're mounted, they can potentially cause fracture. This is especially problematic for shoulder arthroplasty, as the only place a marker can be mounted is a piece of bone that comes off the scapula called the coracoid process. That's very thin. So, while removing markers entirely may not be possible, reducing the reliance on patient-affixed markers or manual registration processes using vision-based technology has significant potential to advance the state of the art in orthopedic robotics. Which brings us to what work has been done already to try and move away from optical tracking systems. Markerless surgical navigation has been reported for both shoulder and knee arthroplasty. In the case of shoulder arthroplasty, these works have been limited to proof of concept papers, focusing on feasibility of using augmented reality. These have all used Microsoft HoloLens. These systems have relied on manual registration, where the user aligns the hologram plan with the patient using hand gestures, or using probe-based registration, which is essentially the same as what current optical systems rely on. None of this work for shoulder arthroplasty has any method for direct patient tracking. Instead, the system registers the position of the patient relative to a fixed world frame, and then it updates the hologram display to the user by tracking the motion of the headset relative to that world frame using the onboard slam capabilities. And those at the moment are recognized as being only about centimeter accurate. This also means that any motion of the patient requires complete system re-registration. Methods published for the knee, however, are significantly more advanced. These include automatic registration and direct patient tracking. These approaches are very similar to current state-of-the-art 6 degree of freedom object pose estimation pipelines, and they make use of both color images and depth information, as well as deep learning and geometric pose recovery. One example, which is pretty representative of the current state of the art, is this method from Gu et al., where the system has co-registered color and depth images. The color image is passed through a pre-trained network, which selects a dynamically sized region of interest around the surgical incision in the image. They then use this region of interest to crop the depth frame. That's resampled to a point cloud. The point cloud is then passed through another pre-trained network, performs segmentation, and selects all of the points in the point cloud that belong to bone. And then that is used to perform registration using what's called a bounded iterative closest point algorithm to align the bone point cloud with the 3D model created of the patient before the surgery. These systems achieve quite a good mean accuracy. However, even the best performing systems at the moment still have high error pose estimates that are beyond the acceptable limits for shoulder arthroplasty, and none of these reported methods have any mechanism to filter out or detect these high error pose estimates. Further, minimal work has been done in visual guidance for orthopedic surgical robots. None of this has been applied to robotic systems. Many of the challenges associated with vision-based guidance for an orthopedic surgical robot are related to camera positioning. The glenoid is deep inside a surgical incision and has a very narrow field of view that it can be viewed from, and harsh operating room lights are are likely to cause specular highlights and the loss of visual features. Active perception, or active vision, is the capability of a robot to automatically position its sensors to improve performance at a vision-based task. And this has the potential to form part of a solution to vision-based guidance in orthopedic robots. In this particular application, we have a lot of freedom of motion and sensor paths. So this means that in this case, active vision is potentially more feasible than other applications like autonomous vehicles, where there's less freedom to position the sensors. But at the moment, the current use of active vision in orthopedic robots has been limited to obstacle avoidance. In these published works, tracking has been performed using a sensor that's attached to a robot arm, and there's also a depth camera mounted on the robot arm. The depth camera is used to detect and track potential obstructions for the tracking sensor's line of sight, and then a control algorithm moves the tracking sensor on the arm away from the predicted trajectory of obstructions. That brings us to our research problem. In our literature review, we have identified the following research gaps. There are no commercial robotic systems available for shoulder arthroplasty. No reported surgical navigation system for orthopedic surgery employs internal performance self-assessment. No automatic or semi-automatic registration system or vision-based tracking system has been reported for the guidance of an orthopedic surgical robot. No automatic or semi-automatic registration system has been reported for the use in shoulder arthroplasty, and vision-based guidance has not been adequately explored. Finally, active vision has not been explored in the use of orthopedic surgical robots beyond occlusion avoidance. With these research gaps in mind, we formulated our research objectives. Overall, our objective is the development of a system to guide an orthopedic robotic surgical assistant during shoulder arthroplasty using vision-based techniques. This is fundamentally a problem of localizing the glenoid relative to a robot accurately and reliably enough that we can perform surgical intervention. And we focus on achieving this through the development of a trustworthy vision-based system that is capable of performance self-assessment. And then we aim to leverage this performance self-assessment to improve the overall performance of our system. To approach this, we formulated our research questions. Our overall research question is, how can we achieve reliable vision-based guidance for a robotic surgical assistant in shoulder arthroplasty? And our sub-questions are, how can a vision-based localization system self-assess accuracy performance to identify instances of localization failure? How can a vision-based localization system leverage self-assessment to improve performance through self-selection of system configurations? How can knowledge of a robot-mounted camera's pose and motion over time be used to develop an improved localization system? And finally, how can localization system self-assessment be used to inform the planning of motion to improve performance? To address these research questions, we formulated our research plan. Our plan consists of 3 separate projects, where each project builds on the one before and is intended to produce a contribution to knowledge in the form of a publication. In our first project, we focus on visual localization quality prediction. Then, in our second project, we look to use that visual localization quality prediction to improve overall performance of our system through the selection of appropriate localization system configurations. And in our third project, we focus on active vision, and we look to develop a method to guide a robot motion to maximize localization performance. Our first project has 2 goals. Our first goal is the development of a robotic guide wire placement demonstration platform. Our intention with this is to gain familiarity with our robot platform, as well as the challenges associated with using vision-based guidance in a robot. But critically, This engineering work will provide us with the opportunity to develop a software framework and a number of software tools to enable our further research. And as a bonus, we gain a demonstration platform for interaction with our industry and clinical partners. In our second goal for Project 1, we address our first research question. Our goal here is the development of a method to predict localization quality. To do this, we implement a localization pipeline. We then, determine the circumstances where the localization system performance breaks down. We examine the internal system parameters during performance breakdown to identify potential predictive factors. And finally, we develop a method to predict when breakdown is happening using only internal system pipeline data. In our second project, we address research question 2. Here, our goal is to build on our contribution from Project 1 to improve localization performance by exploiting knowledge of localization system failure. Our first stage in this work is to tune a range of different localization system configurations that work in different circumstances that we expect to find during surgery. In this, we explore, or rather will explore, different combinations of feature detectors and feature detection parameters, feature matching algorithms, and pose-recovery algorithms. Our second stage in this work is where we develop a method to recover from automatically identified localization system failure through deployment of self-selected situation-appropriate configuration. Our goal here is to be able to deploy a system that is pre-trained or pre-calibrated on each of our system configurations that determines the best configuration for the current scene and deploys it. The key step in this work will be developing a method to score and rank our various system configurations. Comparison of different pose estimation approaches is potentially very challenging. Therefore, we propose to explore scoring different configurations based on the predictive factors that we've used in Project 1. By that, I mean pre-processing the current scene and determining the values for each of our predictive factors and comparing those against the failure thresholds for each of our system configurations and scoring systems based on how far away they are from a predicted failure. In our third project, we hope to address research questions 3 and 4. Here, our goal is to develop a method to exploit knowledge of camera motion over time, simultaneously controlling motion to maximize our localization performance. Here, we look to develop a method that determines viewpoints or sensor paths that will enable our robot to maintain or improve its localization performance. In this, we propose to use a search-based approach where potential sensor views are generated and then evaluated to determine which is the next best view. The key step in this work will be that evaluation of the next best view. As we will be building on our work from Project 2, there may be any one of a number of different system configurations deployed, and the way that we evaluate these next best views is dependent on the localization pipeline that they are being evaluated for. Therefore, we propose to explore reusing our contribution from Project 2. An example of this would be using our stored target model and our current estimate of our target pose to predict which features will be visible from each of our potential viewpoints, then generating a score just like in Project 2 for each of our potential viewpoints and selecting the view with the highest score, so the viewpoint that pushes our system furthest away from predicted failure. Our expected contributions from this work are a method to predict pose estimation errors in systems using local feature matching by comparison of internal pipeline parameters to automatically determine prediction thresholds. We expect to submit this to ITTC RAL or ICRA in late 2022. Our second contribution is expected to be a method to recover from automatically identified localization system failure through deployment of a self-selected situation-appropriate localization system configuration. We expect this to be submitted to IEEE RAL in mid-2023 or RAL ICRA in late 2023. And then our third contribution is expected to be a localization system configuration agnostic active vision system for orthopedic surgery. And this we expect to submit to IEEE RAL IROS or in early 2024 or the International Journal of Robotic Research in mid-2024. And that brings us to our progress so far. The progress that we've made has concentrated on Project 1. Our first goal of developing a robot guide wire placement demonstrator has been completed. In this, we have laid down a good foundation for our future work through developing very flexible software pipelines. We've implemented a visual localization system, and we have successfully deployed to a robot. Our second goal, which is localization quality prediction, is currently in progress. So far, we have performed exploratory experiments. We've developed a very simple prediction method, and we have preliminary prediction results. So in our first goal, which is the robotic guide wire placement demonstrator, we're looking to get our robot to insert a simulated guide wire into a model of a human scapula, doing this using visual localization. Our first step in this work was to build a flexible software framework that enables us to rapidly transition between offline development work and deployment to the robot. We've done this by implementing a Python class, which is intended to run within the robot operating system, or ROS, middleware environment, which is deployed on our robotic systems. The way that we've designed our system, though, means that we can deploy outside of a ROS environment. And to maintain modularity, each of the pieces of code that do heavy lifting within our system, such as our localization system and motion control systems, are implemented as separate classes that are used within our framework when necessary. Using this framework and the tools available within ROS, we are able to interact with external hardware devices, such as cameras and the robot itself. We're also able to load data that's previously saved into our system. So that's things like camera configurations and pre-recorded data sets when we're doing offline testing. We're also able to save data through tools available in ROS, but also arrays of objects, which allows us to maintain the data structures of the information that's passed within our system, which is really useful for offline analysis. And we're also able to perform live visualization using third-party tools that connect to our system. Our second step was to develop a method to perform visual target localization, which in this case is estimating the pose of a target object relative to our robot-mounted camera. We do this by comparing a query image from our robot camera with a reference model of our target using visual features, and then calculating the pose using corresponding positions of those features on the object and in the image frame, which is what's called solving the perspective endpoint problem. We have a two-stage process to this, which consists of model generation and pose recovery. In model generation, we take a reference image of our target object, we extract features, and we determine the 3D position of each feature on our target object. Then, in pose recovery, we take a query image from our robot-mounted camera, we extract features, we match those against the features in our target model. We then take the position of the feature in the query image and on our target model, we pass them into our PNP solver, and we get our pose estimate. For this, we've implemented it using SIFT features, partly due to ease of implementation, but also as SIFT features have shown to have good matching performance in arthroscopy applications, which is minimally invasive orthopedic surgery. And we've used the ePNP algorithm with RANSAC to perform pose estimation, as this is commonly used in a lot of pose estimation pipelines. Our next stage was to deploy our system to our robot platform. Our goal here, as I said, was to localize our scapular model relative to our robot and then insert a K-wire. In this case, our target is a human scapular model with a marker attached to it that allows us to use our visual localization system. And we implemented the behavior of the robot using a finite state machine within our software framework. The states in this system are setup, search, localize, and drill. In setup, our system initializes and builds a model of the target. In search, it performs coarse localization of the marker and then repositions the sensor closer to the marker. In localize, it performs a fine localization by taking repeated pose estimates of the marker and then selecting the median translation and rotation, and then switching to drill. The robot reorients the guide wire with the target, inserts the wire, removes the wire, and resets back to the search state. This implementation completes our first goal of Project 1 and will be expanded in our later work as our capabilities extend. And as a bonus, this has been successfully demonstrated to both industry partners and Queensland government representatives. Following that work, we moved on to our second goal, which is localization quality prediction. Our intention here is to use our robot-mounted camera to take a photograph of a target that we're trying to localize. We then perform pose estimation, and we look to determine whether or not that pose estimate is good or bad. Our first stage of this work was to determine a method to calculate pose estimation error, which we do by comparing the pose estimate that comes out of our pipeline with a known ground truth. For this work, we're using a flat, planar textured target, as it simplifies implementation for our early work, and it simplifies our ground truthing, which we achieve using an Aruco marker. To measure our pose estimate error, we align our target with the marker grid. We perform pose estimation on the target and the marker grid, and then we calculate our pose estimate error as the difference between the poses of the grid and the marker in the camera frame, using these equations here, where we calculate rotational error and translational error separately. After that, we moved on to a series of exploratory experiments. Our goal in these was to determine breakdown conditions of our localization pipeline and to identify potential factors that we can use to predict localization breakdown. And by factor, in this case, I mean internal values within our localization pipeline. To perform this testing, we placed our target on the grid, and then we began introducing different amounts of target occlusion to make it more difficult for our system to perform pose estimation. We then recorded for each of our pose estimates the error and a range of internal pipeline factors, including ransack inlier count, which is the number of features that were actually used to calculate the pose estimate, the feature matching distance, which is a measure of the quality of the features that we've used, reprojection error, feature spread, and a number of others. We then took our recorded data and analyzed it offline by producing plots that showed pose estimation error versus the value of each of our factors. And we did this for translation error and rotation error separately. During this, we identified possible relationships between our inlier count and pose estimation error, and our feature spread and pose estimation error. In our initial experiments, our feature spread was measured as distribution of features across our target object. But this was only measured relative to the X and Y axis of our target object. So to improve this, we switched to measuring feature spread relative to a linear regression. We took the position of each of the features used for the pose estimation in our target object space. We then performed a linear regression on the position of those features and measured the distance from each feature to that line of best fit. We then repeated our experiments using our new measure for feature spread and plotted using our live visualization tools, plots of our pose estimation error and our feature spread, and our pose estimation error and our inlier count. And in this, we identified that a lower inlier count was associated with higher error, and a lower feature spread was associated with higher error. This is an example of one of the plots that we produced in this that shows rotational error for pose estimates and the feature spread, where each of these dots is an individual pose estimate. And as you can see, once the feature spread gets below 4 millimeters, there is a significant increase in the likelihood that any pose estimate has high error. Using this information, we then developed our first simple preliminary prediction method. To do this, we framed our task as a binary classification problem, where each pose estimate produced by our system is assigned a class of good or bad, depending on the error in that pose estimate. In this case, we define a pose estimate as belonging to the good class if both rotation error and translation error are below a threshold, and we define it as belonging to the bad class if rotational error or translational error are above a threshold. We then built the simplest possible prediction method we could think of, which is a binary thresholded classifier, where we predict that a pose estimate is good if the inlier count or the feature spread are above a threshold, and we predict that a pose estimate is bad if the inlier count and the feature spread are both below a threshold. We then performed some quantitative experiments to evaluate our system. To do this, we recorded 4 separate data sets with 3 target images for testing. These data sets were captured using our robot as a very expensive tripod to hold our camera. We captured images of a planar target object on top of our Ruko marker grid, and we introduced occlusions to the scene so that our pose estimation pipeline was just on the edge of breaking. By that, I mean, while we were setting up these scenes, we performed live visualization of our pose estimate error, and we positioned things so that the localization pipeline was returning both good poses and bad poses in a static scene, depending only on the image noise. As I said, we recorded 4 data sets for this testing, and these are example images from those data sets. We changed the position of the camera relative to the scene and the occlusion present between each data set. To complete our data sets, we performed pose estimation on each image within our data set, and then calculated pose estimation error and assigned a ground truth class to every image in the data set. So we know whether each image should be assigned to a good class or a bad class. Then, to evaluate our system, we used our predictor to predict the class for each frame using the thresholds that I described before. We then compared our predicted class to the ground truth class and calculated precision and recall scores for each of our data sets using our prediction system. As far as we're aware, there's no benchmarks in literature that we can evaluate this against. And so for our preliminary testing, we evaluated our system against a weighted random guesser, which is a piece of code that randomly assigns a class to each of our pose estimates. So it randomly assigns good or bad at a rate that we specify. To perform this evaluation, we elected to match the recall of our system and compare precision. So we can tune a system for high recall at the expense of precision, or high precision at the expense of recall. So to properly evaluate our system against this, we needed to match one number and compare the other. To do this, we used our random weighted guesser to make a guess for the class of each pose estimate in our data set, and we performed a parameter sweep until the precision and recall calculated on our weighted random guesser matched the recall of our system. To give the weighted random guesser the best possible chance of beating our system, we performed this 200 times for each data set, independently calculating the recall and precision for the guesser, and we reported the highest precision achieved by the guesser where the recall matched our system. So in our preliminary results here, with the bottom showing us using both inlier and feature spread thresholding for our prediction, the other lines here using just one of those predictive factors. Our system generally outperforms the weighted random guesser, and in none of our testing on any of our data sets did it perform worse. It matched on this data set. Given the simplicity of our system, we consider this very promising. Although we do acknowledge that these experiments are very limited in the number of trials, variation in targets, the type of targets, and our testing diversity. Our next steps in this are to further develop our very initial and simplistic prediction method, and we're looking to explore additional potential predictive factors. So that brings us to our summary. Shoulder arthroplasty is a rapidly growing and challenging orthopedic surgical procedure. A major challenge in this surgery is the correct placement of the glenoid implant. Robotic surgical systems have been shown to improve implant positioning and patient outcomes in other joint replacement surgeries, but there are none available for shoulders at the moment, and they rely on optical tracking, which is particularly problematic in the case of shoulder arthroplasty. Therefore, vision-based systems have potential to reduce our current reliance on manual registration and marker-based tracking. And due to that, we propose the development of a system to guide a robotic surgical assistant for shoulder arthroplasty using vision-based techniques. To achieve this, we've developed a 3-project plan, with each project intended to produce one contribution to knowledge and building on the contribution from the project before it. We are currently working through project 1, where we have completed our first goal, and our second goal, which is to develop a method to predict localization quality, is in progress. Here are the references that I've cited during this seminar that you may find interesting, and I'd like to thank everyone for their attention today.